Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. We are very proud and happy to promote Italian contemporary poetry in the United States and to see that we have a few heroes following us. So really thank you for being here tonight. We had the pleasure this time to introduce at the same time a very important figure of the recent Italian poetry, Antonio Porta, whom you will know more in a little, and a very young, I guess.
Not so.
Oh, okay, I won't ask your age, but youngish, young-looking. Gian Annovi, who is a poet and a scholar, and at the same time we have and it's the first time that Gian is with us tonight, and then we have at my left a more historic friend of the Institute, Jennifer Scappettone, who has already been here at least 2 times. This must be the 3rd. So Gian Annovi, the young-looking guy, is an assistant professor of Italian at the University of Denver. He has published different essays and 4 collections of poetry in Italian. He has been awarded several poetry prizes. He has translated several North American poets, among whom Michael Palmer, Anne Carson, and others. And he is the lucky recipient of the 2011 Pierpaolo Pasolini Award for the best doctoral dissertation, and he is currently working on a manuscript on Pasolini's legacy. And in addition to this, of course, he is the curator of the book we will talk about tonight. So this was about the young-looking guy. The young-looking woman is Jennifer Scappettone, assistant professor of English and creative writing, associated faculty of Romance languages and literatures, and faculty affiliate of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, at the University of Chicago. In 2008, she guest edited a dossier dedicated to contemporary Italian poetry of research for a magazine called Gabe. She has been the editor of a volume of Annovi.
I think this book is important or interesting because it's the very first anthology, real anthology of Antonio Porta. The previous collection were out of print right now. Well, we can find them in some libraries, but they're mostly out of print. Here we can find poems from the very beginning of his career to the very end. Actually, some of the last poems were actually published after Porta's death. Okay, so I think it's a complete survey of his poetry, at least. So it's a good instrument, I think, for scholars and especially students. In my mind, you know, like I'm a teacher, so it's difficult to find these kind of books when you're teaching a class. Translations are always a big issue. So it was an instrument. I was thinking of it. And that's also the spirit in which I wrote my introduction, thinking of people who didn't know anything about Antonio Porta. So, who was Porta? Well, I could start saying that Porta was the youngest member of the, quite famous group of I Novissimi, the newest one. They represented the so-called Italian neo-avant-garde, which started as a movement in the late 50s, even if the actual date of birth of the neo-avant-garde is normally considered 1961, when an anthology, well, I've already mentioned that I Novissimi was, and this is probably the main characteristic of his poetry, believed in a poetry made of things. He didn't believe in a poetry which had to represent reality, but simply to show things, not only visually but rhythmically in a way. So he didn't believe in a mimetic kind of poetry. He didn't believe in a poetry dominated by the presence of the eye. So it's a poetry, we will read something in a minute, where the I is never present. I am of course talking about the 60s right now and early 70s. I'm saying this because later on Porta will change completely his poetics, and his poetry will become extremely communicative, a sort of an open diary, you know.
When Maria asked me to be part of this dialogue, I thought I might talk a little bit about Antonio Porta's relationship to Amelia Rosselli, since I have been immersed in her work for the past decade or so. And he was one of the brave poets who attempted to translate her English poems from a volume subsequently titled Sleep into Italian. Their points of view regarding the translation were quite different, and one of the areas in which they differed was the rhythmic aspect. Rhythm was fundamental for both of these poets, and Rosselli thought that Porta wasn't respecting her enjambments correctly, and she wanted the Italian to have something like the sense of the rhythm of the English, which, as you just heard, it's very difficult to achieve. But the concept of rhythm for these two poets differs in a way that is, I think, fundamental to beginning to explore why Porta was so radical and why he seems very, very contemporary. So that this work, which is work that's now celebrating its 50th anniversary, seems that it could have been written yesterday, and in fact it really reminds me of things that were written practically yesterday by much younger writers such as Gerardo Bortolotti. So whereas there are a number of poets in this period that are seeking something like a universal language, a universal form, seeking something like a stanza that can, in Rosselli's words, act as a kind of receptacle for all of the associative logics and all the rhythms of all the languages. Here we have a situation in which the stanza contains a sort of hammering, that all the rhythms are there, but they've been evened out to such a monotony that any concept of expression is just
a set of subject and verb, anonymous subject and verb, action, command, that do not describe any actual subjectivity, but just rules, action, you know, anonymous rule. And if you read all of it, you can actually see the violence of these actions sometimes. So there's the idea of a word that can make subjects inhuman in a way. So the freedom of reading the poem freely is actually what emancipate and create, you know, like a meaning or, you know, a space of, let's say, hope, bad word, but, you know, for the reader. Well, as I'm going to the image, I'm just going to show you a few. In the book there are a few visual poems by Porta. They are reproduced in black and white, of course. But they are interesting because this one, for example, you can actually, first of all, they show the technique of collage that was, you know, like extremely important for Porta. But you actually see that some of the elements here, non sono poi tanto bestie, they're not so beastly in the end, is actually the title of a poem in one of the collections. So, like, these visual poems become part of the actual collection. Or, for example, here, c'è una porta aperta, there is an open door, Porta, the last name, which is a pen name. The real name of Antonio Porta was Leo Paolazzi. So he picked this name as an homage to Carlo Porta, dialectal Milanese poet, but also because there is the idea of an opening, the possibility to open. To open is one of the most famous poems by Antonio Porta. Or here again, you see the name Antonio Porta is connected to this idea of arte pop. E Porta is contained in arte pop as an anagram. So, you know, it was playing around this idea of opening, being able to open, you know, like to go beyond, you know, to create la palpebra rovesciata.
The eyelid inside out.
Il naso sfalda per divenire saliva il labbro. Alzandosi sopra i denti, liquefa la curva masticata, che con le radici spugnose sulla guancia mordono la ragnatela venosa. Nel tendersi incrina la mascella, lo zigomo si impunta e preme nella tensione dell'occhio, contratto nell'orbita dal nervo fino alla gola, percorsa nel groviglio delle voci, dal battito incessante.
The nose flakes to become saliva, and the lip lifting above the teeth chewed its liquefied curve. Together with spongy roots bite the web of veins on the cheek. In stretching the jawbone cracks, the cheekbone sticks and presses with the eye's tension, contracted in the socket by a nerve all the way in the throat, overrun in the tangle of voices from the incessant...
I wanted to ask you about the sort of the question that you touched on a little bit about performativity in the poems, and the sense of a poet reciting to a public rather than something destined for the page, and that whole dynamic.
One of the major difference between the historic Italian avant-garde and the neo-avant-garde is that the historic avant-garde used manifestos, and the neo-avant-garde, they met. They met at the beginning without any audience. And what they would do was just to read to each other their own text. This seems very obvious today. It wasn't, because in Italy, being a poet meant to be like secluded in your little town, middle of nowhere, not having any relationship with nobody, and they would criticize each other, you know, like fiercely. They fight, you know, like, and it could go on for days.
Still do.
Yeah. So first, that's one element. You know, they started reading to each other and make the practice of reading part of creating, in a way. Rosselli, for example, wrote a series of poems for one of the meetings of the neo-avant-garde in Reggio Emilia, where she actually kind of criticized the fact of being there already in the poem. So, you know, but then, you know, like the meetings, they became open to the audience, and people would just simply read, you know, like one after the other, and this was new in Italy. People would not listen to poetry. They would just read it, you know, at home, or listen to it in class, in elementary school, or at the university. You know, Italian society in the 60s was extremely rigid. You know, like the education was frontal. You would just sit in a room. You were not allowed to ask questions. You would just listen to someone, you know, like saying blah blah blah, end of the class. Okay. It's not like, okay, would you read the piece? It was not like that. It was extremely rigid. There was no, so it was a sort of an act of liberation, you know, like actually the idea of a voice. A poet is not only, you know, what is on the page, but there is the idea of the body, you know, sort of corporeality of the and also Zanzotto wrote about that a lot. Then in the 70s it became huge. There were these incredible manifestations, one in particular, 79, Castelporziano, where also many American poets came, Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, but it turned out into a riot because there were thousands of people on a beach near Ostia, where Pasolini had just been killed, and they were there basically camping, smoking, blah blah blah. So the reading became, you know, like a social practice. But that was just happening in 10 years. And the neo-avant-garde, you know, actually made that happen in a way. Another thing was also that in the 60s, you know, like Fluxus movement became very popular in Italy. Several of the, you know,
Fluxus.
it was like Nam June Paik, Charlotte Mormon. They were artists using for the first time music and new medias like TV. Nam June Paik made sculpture with, you know, tele-TV sets, you know, and they would perform, you know, like we didn't have performance artists in Italy. And I know this for a fact because I know some of the galleries that at the time actually, you know, were allowing. So, you know, there was a sort of like intersection between, you know, what was happening abroad and, you know, sort of an enthusiasm about, you know, like being together and, you know, being poets.
It's also the moment of sound poetry, where
Exactly.
the voice becomes an instrument and there are amazing works performed. But all of this in some way comes out of the futurist serate, the futurist evenings. It's just a sort of rediscovery at a different moment in time and a very different political
Yeah, and
stance.
there's a big, you know, problem between the relationship between futurism and avant-garde. Yeah. I don't know if it was clear before.
Okay, thank you so much, Gian Maria and Jennifer, for this wonderful discussion, and thank you all for coming.